You want to know the first time I understood I didn't exist? I was 7 years old. It was my birthday. My mother had baked a cake, chocolate, 2 layers, the kind with the little sugar flowers on the corners that she always bought from the grocery store and pressed into the frosting like she'd made them herself. I remember the candles, 7 of them, orange and white, because those were the only ones left in the drawer. My father called us both to the table, me and my brother Nathan. Nate was 5. He had my mother's eyes and my father's jaw, and he had this way of walking into a room like the room had been built specifically for him, like the floors had been laid in anticipation of his footsteps. My father set the cake down in front of Nathan. Not me, Nathan. And Nate, God bless his 5-year-old heart, he blew the candles out before I could say a word, and everyone clapped. My aunts, my cousins, my grandmother who smelled like lavender and old money, they all clapped for Nathan on my birthday. I looked at my mother. She was smiling. She was looking at Nathan. I spent the rest of that party standing by the back window, watching the neighbor's dog run laps around their yard, wondering what the dog had done to deserve all that open space to run in. That was my first lesson. In the Carter household of Millbrook, Ohio, I occupied space, but I did not fill it. I breathed air, but no one noticed the air move. I was the firstborn son of Gerald and Diane Carter. Gerald, who owned Carter Realty Group, one of the largest commercial real estate development firms in the state of Ohio, and from the moment Nathan learned to walk, I became furniture. Background furniture, the kind you stop seeing after a while. By the time I was 12, I understood 2 things with absolute clarity. The first was that Nathan was being groomed to inherit everything. My father walked him through every business meeting, every site visit, every negotiation. He bought Nathan a little briefcase at age 8, actual leather, monogrammed, and put toy contracts inside it and made him practice shaking hands. Strong grip, he'd say. Always a strong grip, son. And Nathan would beam at him, and my father would beam back, and I would eat my dinner and try to remember if I had any homework due. The second thing I understood was that I was different. Not broken different, not wrong different, just different. The way I looked at things, the way certain music made my chest ache, the way I noticed the older boys on the swim team in a way that confused me and then clarified me and then terrified me all at once when I was about 13 and figured out what it meant. I didn't tell anyone. Obviously, I didn't tell anyone. I had watched my father's face when gay marriage had come up on the news, that tight jaw, that slow, deliberate channel change, and I had learned something important. Whatever I was, it was the kind of thing that made Gerald Carter change the channel. So I folded it, tucked it behind my sternum like a letter I was too afraid to send. I went to school, I got good grades, I did everything right, and it didn't matter, because at home I was still the boy standing by the back window, watching someone else run in the yard that should have been mine. At 16, my father gave Nathan his first car. A used Honda, nothing flashy, but it was given with ceremony. Keys on a keychain, the whole family gathered in the driveway, photos taken. At 18, I got a bus pass and a reminder that I needed to figure out my own future because Carter Realty Group had a succession plan and it didn't include me. He said it like that, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee. It doesn't include you, Eli. Like he was informing me of a zoning ordinance, something administrative, something already decided long before I walked into the room. I remember Nathan was sitting right there at that table. He didn't say a word. He just poured himself another glass of orange juice, and his eyes met mine over the rim of the glass, and there was something in them. Not guilt, not apology, satisfaction. That was the first time I saw my little brother clearly. Not as someone who benefited from the favoritism, but as someone who cultivated it, who fed it, who went to my parents when I was 15 and told them he'd heard something about me and Caleb Morrison from the soccer team. He told my mother he was worried, that he thought I might be confused. He was 12 years old and he already knew how to use information like a blade. My mother cried. My father went silent for 3 days, then called me into his study and told me, quietly, the way a man tells you something he considers deeply shameful, that whatever phase I was going through needed to end, that there were Carter family values, that there was a Carter family name. That was the conversation that made me realize I had always been, in their eyes, a liability. not a son, a liability. I stayed out of everyone's way after that. I went to Ohio State. I studied architecture. I worked 2 jobs to pay for my own textbooks because my father paid for Nathan's college fund and considered mine a personal expense I should handle myself. I didn't ask for help. I didn't go home for Thanksgiving my junior year. I told myself I was fine. I was building something, my own thing, my own life. And for 2.5 years, I almost believed it. Then Warren Holt found out about me. Warren Holt was my father's business partner of 22 years. He'd been at every Carter family Christmas, every firm anniversary dinner, every important milestone I was never invited to be part of. He was a wide man with small eyes and a handshake that lasted just a beat too long, and he had always looked at me in a way I couldn't name until I was old enough to recognize it. I was 22, home for the summer between my junior and senior year, not because I wanted to be, but because I'd had a plumbing disaster in my apartment and was waiting for repairs. My father was barely home. My mother treated me like a guest she hadn't invited. Nathan was interning at Carter Realty under my father's direct supervision, being groomed and polished and prepared. Warren came to the house one afternoon when my father was away at a site in Columbus. He said he needed to pick up some documents. I let him in. Why wouldn't I? He was practically family, wasn't he? He didn't want documents. He had photographs. He'd had someone following me, apparently. Pictures of me with a man I had dated briefly, Marcus, gentle, patient Marcus, who'd taken me to a rooftop restaurant and held my hand across the table because I'd finally, for the first time in my life, let myself be held. Those photographs were spread across my father's kitchen table, and Warren Holt stood behind them with his small eyes and his too long handshake, and he told me exactly what he wanted. I won't dignify what he wanted by naming it. I told him no. He said if I said no, he would make sure my father saw every photograph before sundown. He said he would make sure the entire Millbrook business community knew what kind of man the Carter heir really was. He said he would destroy me. And then he took a step toward me, and I backed away, and I caught the edge of the kitchen counter with my elbow, and he stumbled. He stumbled. On the rug, the thick Persian runner my mother had bought at auction and always bragged about, and he went backward and he hit the corner of the stone fireplace in the living room, and he went down. And he didn't get up. I stood there for 30 seconds, maybe less, maybe more. Time does something strange in moments like that. It turns elastic and useless. I knelt beside him. I checked for a pulse. I called 911. I was on the phone with the dispatcher when my parents came through the front door early, back from Columbus because my father had gotten a call. He'd gotten a call from Warren's cell phone. I didn't understand that for years, that Warren had a partner in this, that the whole thing had been orchestrated as a trap, not quite the way it played out, but a trap nonetheless. And when it went sideways, my parents were already primed and ready. I've replayed what happened next 10,000 times in the dark. My mother walked in, saw Warren on the floor, and started screaming. My father looked at Warren, then looked at me, and the calculation happened in real time. I watched it move across his face like weather. He took the phone out of my hand. He told the dispatcher there had been an accident. He hung up. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw it. I swear to God, I saw the exact moment he chose. He chose Nathan. He chose the company. He chose the name. He looked at me and said, "You did this. You attacked him. You pushed him." I said, "Dad." He said, "Warren was going to expose you. You snapped. You killed him." My mother was already nodding. She was nodding before he finished the sentence, like the script had been written and she had already memorized her lines. She started crying, the real kind, not performed, because I think some part of her actually grieved. Not for me, for the version of herself that had to do this. She wept, and she backed away from me like I was something dangerous, and she said, "How could you, Eli? How could you do this to us?" To us. To them. Warren Holt was already dead on the floor of my parents' house, and my mother's first instinct was to cast me as the villain in their story. Nathan came home 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway and looked at the scene. He looked at me, hands shaking, phone on the floor, Warren's body between us, and he did the same calculation my father had done. And then he put his hand on my father's shoulder and said softly, "I'll handle the statement, Dad." He was 20 years old. I was arrested that evening. My father hired lawyers to prosecute, not to defend. He gave a statement to the police that his son had been in a violent rage over a family dispute, that Warren had tried to intervene, that the assault had been unprovoked and cold-blooded. My mother corroborated. Nathan corroborated. 3 Carters against 1. My attorney, a public defender with a caseload the size of a moving truck and the same expression of exhausted apology in every meeting, told me the evidence was stacked against me. There were no witnesses. There was no security footage in the living room. The photographs Warren had brought were gone. My father had taken them. Everything was gone, except my word, which was worth nothing, against the word of Gerald Carter, whose name was on half the commercial buildings in Millbrook, Ohio. I was convicted of second-degree murder, sentenced to 15 years. They sent me to Hargrove Correctional Facility. I was 22 years old, and my family had buried me alive.
The first thing you notice about prison is the sound. Not the yelling or the clanging or the things you've seen in movies. The first thing is the particular quality of the silence between the sounds. A weighted, watchful silence that understands exactly how small you are and wants to make sure you understand it too. I arrived at Hargrove in October. The trees outside the transport van windows were losing their leaves, and I remember thinking that was appropriate. Everything stripped down to bare structure, everything becoming only what it essentially was. I was terrified. I won't dress that up. I was a 22-year-old architecture student who had spent 6 months in a county jail waiting for a trial that had already been decided before it began. And now I was in a maximum security facility in central Ohio with people who had done things I had only read about. And I had done nothing. Nothing except exist in the wrong place at the wrong moment in the wrong family. The first week, I kept to myself, ate alone, slept with my back against the wall, learned the geography, who stood where, who owned which tables in the yard, who you made eye contact with, and who you absolutely did not. There was a man named Declan who ran a crew from the East Block and had decided on my second day that I owed him something for the crime of looking educated. He and his people followed me to the showers on a Thursday morning, and I knew what was about to happen, and I had already accepted it as the kind of helpless horror my life had become, when the water stopped running in the adjacent shower, and a man stepped out, Roman Calloway. I had heard the name before I saw the face. You heard Roman Calloway's name before you saw him, the way you heard thunder before lightning. He was 31, 9 years older than me, and he had been at Hargrove for 4 years by the time I arrived. He had a kind of presence that I have since spent years trying to accurately describe and have never managed. He was tall, not intimidatingly so, but tall in the way that made you aware of vertical space in a room. He had a face that was all clean geometry, like something designed rather than born, with dark eyes that processed everything they looked at completely before they moved on to the next thing. He stepped out of that shower and he looked at Declan's crew with an expression of complete, unruffled patience. He said, and I remember every word, "You're in my way." That was it, 4 syllables, and Declan's crew, 5 grown men who had been moving toward me with specific intent, stepped back, all of them, like a tide retreating from a particular shore. Declan looked at Roman for a moment, and then looked at me, and then looked back at Roman, and some calculation resolved itself, and he left. Roman looked at me then. Not with pity, that's important. Not the way people looked at me in that courtroom, or the way my public defender had looked at me, or the way the correctional officers looked at new inmates, that mixture of boredom and mild contempt. He looked at me the way someone looks at a thing they are genuinely curious about, like they want to understand it. He said, "You're the architect." I blinked. What? "Your intake form. It listed your major." He picked up his towel from the rack. "I read everything." That was the beginning. I learned Roman's story in pieces, the way you learn everything important, in fragments, over time. accumulated the way sediment accumulates, until one day you realize you have been building a foundation. Roman Calloway had grown up in Cincinnati. His father had been a contractor who built himself up to owning a small but respected construction company, Calloway & Sons. 3 decades of work, a real thing, a living thing. When Roman was 26, his 2 best friends, Derek and Paulson, men he had known since middle school, men he had trusted with his money and his signature and his future, had embezzled the company's accounts over 18 months, transferred assets into shell corporations, and then reported Roman to the SEC for the fraud they themselves committed. The evidence had been impeccable because they had built it. Roman had been convicted of financial fraud and securities violations and given 7 years at Hargrove. His father had lost the company. His father had died 2 years into Roman's sentence, heart attack, alone in the house in Cincinnati that was now mortgaged to someone else, and Roman had been taken to the funeral in handcuffs and returned to his cell the same day. He told me this on a Tuesday evening. We were sitting at the end of the East Yard tables, a particular spot that had, over time and without ceremony, become understood as Roman's place, which meant no one sat there unless they were invited. He told me his story the way a man reports the weather, precisely, without sentimentality, without editing, just the facts assembled in order, each one its own small devastation. When he finished, I said, "I'm sorry." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's interesting, the 2 of us." I asked him what he meant. He said, "The people who should have protected us were the ones who destroyed us." I didn't say anything, because there was nothing to add to that. He had said the whole of it in 14 words, and we both sat with it in the October evening, in that yard surrounded by razor wire and floodlights, and something passed between us that I still don't have precise language for. A recognition, maybe. The specific relief of being seen by someone who is also seen. After that, we talked every day. He taught me chess on a board at the recreation room kept in a drawer held together with electrical tape. I taught him perspective drawing with a stub of pencil and the backs of napkins from the commissary. How to find the vanishing point. How to make distance feel like distance on a flat surface. He would hold up my sketches and examine them with that same patient, complete attention he gave everything, and then he would say something that surprised me, about line or about structure, and I would realize that beneath the silence he was always thinking, always building towards something. He made me feel, for the first time in my living memory, like what I said was worth hearing. One morning in November, I came into the dining hall and found my tray knocked over by 2 of Declan's associates, a thing that had been happening with enough frequency to be a message rather than an accident. I was crouching to clean it up when a second tray appeared beside my hands on the floor. I looked up, and Roman was there on one knee, picking up the pieces of my spilled breakfast with the same unhurried dignity he brought to everything. Declan's table was watching. 60 men were watching. Roman Calloway, the Don of Hargrove Correctional Facility, on his knee on a dining hall floor, picking up scattered toast and an overturned carton of orange juice, and doing it like it was the most natural thing in the world. He reassembled my tray. He set it on the table. He sat down across from me and began eating his own breakfast, and the message he had sent to that room was clearer and more complete than anything that could have been said aloud. This one is mine to protect. Nobody touched my tray again.
There is a particular kind of tenderness that exists in places where tenderness is not supposed to survive. I want you to understand that before I tell you the rest. Hargrove was not a gentle place. It was a place of concrete and fluorescence and the constant low-grade anxiety of proximity to danger, of never fully sleeping, of keeping one part of your mind always watching the door. It stripped things away. Unnecessary things, soft things, the social conventions you don't know you rely on until they're gone. And in their absence, the things that remained were more visible, more honest. What remained between Roman and me was visible and honest, and I have never been ashamed of a single moment of it. He started doing small things, specific, deliberate small things that accumulated the way his story had accumulated into a foundation. In December, a head cold swept through my block. Nothing serious, but I felt terrible for a week. The particular misery of being sick in a place with no comfort available, no one to bring you soup, nowhere soft to be. On the third day, Roman came to my cell during free hour and set a cup of hot tea on my bunk. Actual tea, not the institutional kind, which meant he had traded something for it from the officer who ran the commissary cart on weekends. He didn't say much. He sat on the floor beside my bunk with his back against the wall and read from a second-hand copy of East of Eden aloud, not performing it, just reading, steadily, for almost an hour, like my only job was to lie there and let his voice be the one thing that filled the room. I fell asleep before he finished the chapter. When I woke up, he was gone, but the book was on my bunk, open to where he'd stopped. In January, there was an incident in the yard. A new inmate, young, scared, coming at everything sideways the way fear makes you, shoved me from behind without warning, and I caught myself on the ground with both palms and split one open on the concrete. It wasn't serious, but Roman saw it from across the yard, and he was at my side before I had finished standing up. He didn't go after the other man. That surprised me. He just took my bleeding hand in both of his and looked at the cut with that thorough attention, and then he tore a strip from the hem of his own undershirt, just tore it without hesitation, and bound my palm with it, tying it cleanly and firmly, and then held my hand between both of his for a moment without speaking. Later, I told him he didn't have to do that. He said, "I know." And then, after a pause, "That's what makes it mean something." In March, there was an evening I want to tell you about that I think about often. It was the night before the anniversary of my conviction. I hadn't told anyone it was the anniversary. I had been sitting in the recreation room for an hour doing nothing, just sitting with the weight of it. 1 year of my life gone, 14 ahead of me, and my family in Millbrook going to dinner and signing contracts and living lives built on what they'd taken from me, and I was trying very hard not to come apart. Roman sat beside me. He didn't ask what was wrong, he just sat. And then, after a long time, he said, "Tell me what you would have built." I looked at him. "If none of this happened," he said, "tell me what you would have designed." So I told him. I told him about the community center I'd been designing for my thesis, a building with a specific kind of roof that collected rainwater, and a courtyard designed around the path of natural light through the day, so there was always one warm, bright spot no matter what time it was. I told him about the philosophy of it, that architecture should make people feel held by space, not contained by it, that there was a difference between a building that processed human beings and a building that received them. He listened without interrupting. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You'll build it. That building exists. It just doesn't have a location yet." I don't know exactly what happened to me in that moment. Something cracked open that I had been keeping sealed, some valve of grief and longing and the particular anguish of being 23 years old and having your entire future stolen by the people who were supposed to hand it to you. I didn't cry. I didn't. I held it. But Roman must have seen something in my face because he put his hand over mine on the cable and he left it there. And I turned my palm up and our fingers closed together. And for the first time since they'd put the handcuffs on me in my parents' kitchen, I did not feel alone. We sat like that until the bell rang. I have to tell you about the day with the water. It is, by now, a somewhat of a legend at Hargrove. The men who were there still talk about it, I'm told. I don't think of it as a legend. I think of it as the day I understood exactly what Roman Calloway was made of. It was April. We had been given access to the yard for a long period, one of those rare idle Saturdays where the administration was short-staffed and nobody was moving us anywhere, and a pipe had burst near the east showers, leaving standing water across a stretch of the corridor. I had walked through it coming back from the yard and cut my foot on a piece of debris in the water, a sliver of something sharp, a screw or tile fragment, and by evening my right foot was swollen and infected enough that I was limping badly. The medical unit had a 2-day wait. I was not a priority case. Roman came to my cell that evening with a basin, a large plastic storage bin from the commissary, filled with warm water he had somehow heated, and a bar of soap that was better than the institutional kind, and clean cloth. He set it all on the floor beside my bunk without fanfare, without ceremony, and then he sat on the floor and lifted my injured foot into the basin. There were men in the corridor. The cells at Hargrove were not entirely private. The bars were visible from the walkway, and there were men watching. Roman did not look up. He took my foot in his hands and he washed it, carefully, methodically, with the same precise attention he gave to everything he cared about. He cleaned the cut. He dried my foot with the cloth. He applied ointment from a small tube he must have gotten from somewhere at some cost, and he bandaged the wound with actual gauze. And then, and this is the part that became the legend, he did not just set my foot down. He held it in my lap for a moment, with both hands wrapped around my heel, and bowed his head over it and was still. Not performing, not demonstrating, just still.
In 60-odd men's understanding of the world, what they were witnessing was impossible. Roman Calloway did not kneel for anyone. Roman Calloway had stood in front of a parole board and spoken with such calm authority that 3 officers had called it the most composed thing they'd ever seen in that room. Roman Calloway had once ended a potential riot in the yard with 12 words. And Roman Calloway was sitting on the floor of cell block C with his forehead nearly touching a man's injured foot, and the tenderness of it was so complete and undefended that the corridor had gone absolutely silent. I looked down at the top of his head, at the back of his neck, at the curve of his shoulders, and how they were completely unguarded in that moment. No armor, no performance, just a man doing something for someone he cared about because he could, because it needed doing, because care without gesture is just intention. My throat was so tight I could barely breathe. He looked up at me eventually, those dark eyes, unhurried and direct. He said, "Does it feel better?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Good." And he began wrapping the gauze. The men in the corridor dispersed slowly, quietly, the way people leave a church. I heard later that Declan had been among them, that he had watched the whole thing, that he'd walked away and not said a single word about it to anyone, which, from Declan, was its own form of reverence. The years passed. That sounds simple. It wasn't. Each one was its own endurance, its own particular shape of loss, the things that happened outside the walls that reached me only in fragments. Nathan's promotion to CEO of Carter Realty, announced in a local business journal that someone left in the recreation room. My mother's birthday that came and went without a card or a letter or any acknowledgement that I was still a living person with a mother. My father's expansion of the company into 2 new Ohio counties, a project I had once overheard him say he'd planned to give me someday, back when I had been allowed to sit at the table. I read every piece of information about the outside world that I could find. I wasn't doing it to torture myself. I was doing it the way a general reads maps, studying terrain I would one day need to navigate. Roman understood that instinctively. He had been doing the same thing with his case. Over 4 years before I arrived, and every year after, he had been building carefully, systematically, using every legal resource available, every contact he maintained through letters, every piece of information that could be gathered from the outside. His attorney, a woman named Priya Anand out of Columbus, had believed from the beginning that he'd been framed and had never stopped working the case. We built our legal arguments together the way I had once designed buildings structurally, from the foundation up, testing every load-bearing point for weakness before adding the next layer. Roman had the business acumen, the ability to follow money through corporate structures with the same fluency I followed load paths through architecture. I had the patience for documentation, the ability to sit with 100 pages of financial records and find the thread. We were, it turned out, extraordinarily good at finding threads. In my third year, Roman's case was reopened. New forensic accounting had surfaced discrepancies in Paulson's records, discrepancies consistent with a frame. Priya filed for an appeal. Roman was released on my third year, first month, 11th day. I remember that morning, standing in the yard, watching him collect his things. The sky was the particular flat gray of February in Ohio. He came to find me before he left. They gave him that, the officers, a small mercy or maybe just indifference to protocol. He stood in front of me in civilian clothes, a gray sweater, clean jeans, and for a moment he just looked at me in that complete, unhurried way. He said, "I'm not going anywhere." I said, "Roman." "I'm not going anywhere," he repeated. "I'm going to get Priya to look at your case. I'm going to get into those financials. I'm going to find everything. And when you walk out of here, I'll be at the gate." I believed him. Not because I was naive. I had learned the distance between what people said and what they meant. I believed him because in 3 years I had never once heard Roman Calloway say a thing he didn't mean. He left. He kept his word. I wanted to be precise about what happened to me in those remaining years. I did not become cold. I know that's the story people tell the wrongfully imprisoned man who comes out with ice where his heart used to be. That's not accurate. What happened was more like a metallurgical process. You take something soft and you apply sustained, extreme pressure and heat, and it doesn't become nothing. It becomes harder, more refined. The impurities are burned away, and what's left is the essential structure, clarified and dense and stronger than it was before. I stopped grieving my family. That was the first transformation. The grief had been there for years, the grief of a child who still, somewhere underneath everything, wanted his father to choose him, wanted his mother to look at him, wanted to be the kind of son they could love. That grief had been a weakness, and weaknesses in places like Hargrove are an invitation. I held it one last time one evening in my 5th year, alone in my cell. I let myself feel the full scope of it, the entirety of what had been taken from me, starting on my 7th birthday and ending in a courtroom where 3 members of my own family looked the judge in the eye and called me a murderer. And then I set it down. I didn't replace it with hatred, exactly. I replaced it with clarity. Hatred wants to destroy. Clarity wants to correct. There's a difference, and the difference matters. Roman and Priya found, over 3 years of work from the outside, a significant amount. They found that Warren Holt had not acted alone in building the extortion trap. They found correspondence, deleted but recoverable, between Warren and Nathan Carter, who had fed Warren the information about me, who had helped orchestrate the blackmail as a way of forcing me out of any potential inheritance claim before my father changed his mind. They found that my father's statement to the police had contained demonstrable inconsistencies with the physical evidence that his lawyers had successfully buried during the original proceedings. They found a witness, a neighbor's housekeeper who had been in the Carter house that afternoon and seen Warren arrive and heard raised voices and had been told by my father that her immigration status would be complicated if she spoke to anyone. They found her. She spoke. By my 6th year, Priya had enough to file a motion for a new trial. By my 7th year, the conviction was overturned. The day the judge read the decision, I was in a courtroom in Millbrook, same county, different judge. My father and mother were in the gallery. I had not seen their faces in 7 years. They looked older. My father's hair had gone entirely white. My mother held her hands in her lap, very still, the way she used to hold them in church. Nathan wasn't there. I had wondered if he would be. He wasn't. The judge finished reading the decision and looked at me and said that the court recognized a fundamental miscarriage of justice and extended its formal acknowledgement of the same. She said my conviction was vacated, my record expunged, and that I was free to go. I looked straight ahead. I felt nothing in that moment, not the wave of relief I had imagined for 7 years. Nothing. just the hard, dense clarity of a man who has completed one phase and is moving into the next. And then I heard the back doors of the courtroom open. And I looked back, and Roman was there, standing in the aisle, dressed in a dark coat, 7 years older, which had done nothing to him except deepen the geometry of his face and put a few gray threads in his hair. He was looking at me the way he had always looked at me, completely, without agenda, with that specific quality of attention that made you feel like you were the most important thing in the room. He nodded once. I turned back to the front of the courtroom. I breathed. I let myself feel it then, just briefly. The grief and the rage and the 7 years and the birthday cake with the wrong name and the Persian rug and the handcuffs and the photograph of Nathan's promotion and Roman's hands wrapping my injured foot on a cell block floor, all of it compressed into one sustained, silent, enormous feeling that moved through me like weather and then was gone. I stood up. I walked out of Hargrove Correctional Facility on Thursday morning in late September. Roman was at the gate. I had asked him in the weeks leading up to my release, through Priya, through the phone calls we had managed, if he was sure about this, about what came next. He had said, "Eli, when have I not been sure?" And I had no answer for that, because Roman Calloway had never once in 7 years been unsure about anything that mattered. He was standing just beyond the gate line, in that same gray sweater, because apparently it was his uniform. He had his hands in his pockets, and he was watching me walk toward him with that unguarded attention, and I was aware of the gate closing behind me, aware of the sky, which was enormous and unchained, aware of every square inch of open air that I had forgotten over 7 years of walls. I stopped in front of him. He said, "Hey." I said, "Hey." We stood there for a moment, just that. And then he reached out and put his hand on my shoulder the way he always had, the specific weight and warmth of it, and I let myself lean into that contact for just a moment, and he let me, and that was enough. We had work to do. Roman had not been idle in 3 years. That is perhaps the understatement of this entire story. Roman Calloway had spent 3 years building the same way he built everything, from the foundation, systematically, testing every load-bearing point. He had reconnected with his former business contacts, rebuilt Calloway Construction under a new entity, and positioned it as a competitor to Carter Realty Group, quietly, efficiently, in ways that didn't signal an attack until the attack was already complete. He had hired Priya Anand not just for my appeal, but as corporate counsel. He had brought in a financial investigator named Jerome Watts, who had spent 18 months following the money trail Nathan had helped Warren Holt build, and what Jerome had found was comprehensive, documented, and devastating. Nathan Carter had, over the course of 10 years, systematically looted Carter Realty Group's subsidiary accounts to fund a personal real estate portfolio in his own name. He had forged my father's signature on 3 major asset transfers. He had been the architect, and I use that word with full intention, of a corporate fraud that made what Roman's friends had done to Calloway Construction look like small change. My father, it turned out, had not known the full extent. That was the tragedy at the center of it. Gerald Carter had built a dynasty and handed it to a thief because the thief had looked like what my father wanted to see, and my father had been too proud and too invested to look carefully. Nathan had not just stolen from me, he had stolen from everyone. We brought the evidence to the SEC and to the Ohio Attorney General's office simultaneously. We brought it with documentation so thorough, so precisely organized, Jerome's financial work and my architectural eye for structural integrity applied to legal documents, that the investigation lasted only 4 months before indictments came down. Nathan was arrested on a Monday. I know because Roman called me as it was happening, and I was standing in the kitchen of the apartment in Columbus I had been renting for 6 weeks, and I felt, not triumph exactly, something quieter. The specific, bone-deep satisfaction of a correct answer. He was convicted on 11 counts. He was sentenced to 9 years at a facility in northeastern Ohio. My father came to see me after the conviction. He stood in the lobby of the building where I had taken a consulting position with an architecture firm Priya had recommended me. I had real credentials, my record was expunged, and it turned out 7 years of studying documentation had made me extraordinarily good at construction contract review. And he stood there in a lobby with his white hair and his careful hands, and he looked at me, and I waited. He said, "I know I can't." He stopped, started again. "I know there's nothing I can—" I said, "No, there isn't." He said, "Your mother." I said, "I know." He aged 10 years standing in front of me. I watched it happen, and I felt grief, not for him, for the father I had never had and had spent 22 years hoping would materialize. That grief was old and had already been set down. I felt it the way you feel the ghost of a healed wound present, but not controlling. I said, "I'm going to make sure you're taken care of, both of you. You'll have a good facility, good care, and people who look after you properly. You won't want for anything practical." He blinked. "A facility?" "Your home is in Nathan's name," I said. "You knew that, or you didn't look closely enough to know, which amounts to the same thing at law. The asset transfers Nathan made included the house. It's part of the fraudulent estate. You don't have anywhere to go, Dad." I said the last word deliberately, Dad. Let it hang there. "I've arranged placement at Elmwood Commons in Dublin. Private rooms, a garden. Priya has the paperwork." My father stood there for a long moment. I watched him try to find something to say, something that bridged the distance between what he'd done and what I was doing in response to it. He couldn't find it. There was no bridge. There was only the fact of it. He said, quietly, "Why?" I said, "Because I'm not what you told the court I was. I never was." And I walked back to the elevators. Carter Realty Group was restructured under receivership after the fraud investigation. The legitimate assets, the properties, the client relationships, and the brand equity that my father had actually built were auctioned in a managed process. Roman Callaway, through Callaway Development Group, submitted the winning bid for the commercial portfolio. I became the firm's lead design architect. Not because Roman handed it to me, because I had 7 years of studying construction documents, building codes, structural engineering principles, and the architecture of human endurance, and because I was, even at 29, one of the most thorough and precise structural minds in Ohio, and Priya had found me 3 clients before my first month was out. Because I was, it turned out, quite good at building things. I have been thinking about the right way to end this, and I keep coming back to something small. A few months after my release, Roman and I drove back through Millbrook on the way to a site visit in the next county. I hadn't been back. We drove through the center of town, the same streets, the same stores. Some of them changed, some exactly as I remembered, and I looked out the window at the building where Carter Realty Group had had their offices, now empty, the signage stripped, just a clean commercial facade waiting for a new tenant. Roman was driving. He glanced at me. I said, "I'm okay." He said, "I know. I was going to tell you that you've been quiet for 12 miles, and I wanted to know what you were thinking about."
I said, "That community center. The one I told you about. The one with the roof that collects rainwater." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Millbrook has 3 underserved neighborhoods on its east side. I've been looking at plots." I looked at him. He looked at the road. The right building in the right place makes people feel held by space, not contained by it. He glanced at me again. "That's what you said." He had been carrying that for 5 years. That sentence from a napkin drawing evening in a prison recreation room, 2 men with nowhere to go and everything to prove, talking about buildings that hadn't been built yet in places that didn't exist yet. He had been carrying it and waiting. I want you to understand what that means. Not as a dramatic gesture, not as a grand declaration, as a fact. Roman Callaway heard something I said in the worst year of my life, stored it with the same care he stored everything important, and held it until he could do something with it. That is the kind of person he is. That is the kind of person, the only kind of person, worth walking out of any gate for. Epilogue. So here is where I bring you back to the beginning. I am 29 years old. I was invisible for 22 years and imprisoned for 7, and I have spent the last months building with my own hands, my own mind, my own credentials, a practice and a life and a future that no one gave me. My brother is in a cell in northeastern Ohio. I don't hate him. I don't visit him. He exists in my life the way background furniture exists, present in the room, not filling it. Perhaps one day that will change. Perhaps not. My parents are at Elmwood Commons. My mother has a Gurdon plot. My father has a chess set. Priya sends someone to check on them monthly. I have not visited. Perhaps one day that will change. Perhaps not. Warren Holt's death was ruled accidental by the new investigation. It always was accidental. I knew that. The law now knows that. I need you to know that. The community center in East Millbrook is in the design phase. The roof system that collects rainwater will feed a garden on the south side of the building. The courtyard is oriented to catch the late afternoon light in a specific way that means there is always one warm, bright spot regardless of the season. I have a desk. I have drafting pencils and an architectural license and morning coffee in a mug I chose myself, in an apartment where every object was selected by me for reasons that are mine. I have Roman. This is not a love story dressed up as a revenge story, or a revenge story that accidentally became a love story. It is the story of two men who were buried by people who should have protected them and who found each other in the dark, and who, through patience and precision and an absolute refusal to become what the worst moments tried to make them, built their way back to the surface. 7 years. 15 was the sentence. 7 was what it took. I think about that sometimes. I think about the other 8 years, the ones I don't have to serve, the ones that were returned to me, that exist now as open space, as undesigned rooms waiting for what I choose to put in them. I walked out of those gates on a Thursday morning in September. Roman was there. The sky was enormous. And for the first time in my life, for the absolute first time in the 29 years I have been alive on this earth, I walked forward without looking back. Not because there was nothing behind me, because everything in front of me was mine.
The end.